By 1977, ARP Instruments employed 200 people in a 50,000 square foot factory in Lexington, Massachusetts, building synthesizers by hand. They held 40% of the global market, again more than Moog, more than anyone. Their instruments gave R2D2 his voice, scored Stevie Wonder's classic albums, and communicated with aliens on a Spielberg soundstage. Then, one decision changed everything. Management bet $4 million on a guitar synthesizer called the Avatar, a product the founder opposed in writing that couldn't track a note without a 40-millisecond delay, that sold a quarter of what the business plan projected. The losses wiped out the company's reserves. A willing buyer offered $10 a share. The board refused. By 1981, ARP was bankrupt. The assets sold for $350,000. The factory is a biotech campus now. This is the story of how a NASA engineer named Alan Pearlman built the instruments that shaped the sound of the 1970s, and how a single product, one bet, pushed through over his objections, silenced a factory that had given voice to a generation, not through market forces, not through foreign competition, through a choice made inside the building where the work was done. The story starts, as so many American technology stories do, with a man who was brilliant at building things and terrible at running them. In the late 1960s, in a basement workshop somewhere in suburban Massachusetts, a 53-year-old aerospace engineer named Alan Robert Pearlman heard a record album that changed his life. Pearlman had spent 20 years designing circuits, first operational amplifiers at a Boston research firm, then precision electronics for NASA's Gemini and Apollo space capsules. He wasn't a musician. He was, by every account, the furthest thing from a rock star. Soft-spoken, humble almost to a fault, the kind of man his own daughter described as not a fame seeker and not a big small-talk guy. He held more than 20 patents. He played classical piano. He wore a tie to work. But in 1968, Wendy Carlos's Switched On Bach hit the Billboard charts. Bach performed entirely on a Moog synthesizer, 1 million copies sold, 3 Grammy Awards, and something clicked inside the engineer's brain. Pearlman went to his basement and started tinkering. He consulted friends. One at Brown University's Electronic Music Lab used a Moog. A Harvard composer named Leon Kirshner used a Buchla. Pearlman studied both instruments and found them technically wanting. And the Moog's oscillators drifted out of tune as the temperature in a room changed. The Buchla didn't have a proper keyboard. For an engineer who'd built circuits stable enough for outer space, these problems weren't mysteries. They were solvable. He spent 2 years building something better. What he couldn't build, and what nobody warned him about, was a company that could survive its own success. The instruments Pearlman designed would shape the sound of the 1970s, give a voice to cinema's most beloved robot, help communicate with fictional aliens on a Spielberg soundstage, and outsell every synthesizer manufacturer on the planet. Then a single product decision, pushed through over his objections by men he'd trusted, would burn through $4 million and destroy it all. But that collapse was a decade away. In 1969, Alan Pearlman had $100,000, a cinder block warehouse, and a conviction that he could build the best electronic musical instrument in the world. He was right about the instrument. He was wrong about almost everything else. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. Pearlman came from a lineage of tinkerers. Born June 7th, 1925 in Manhattan, he grew up surrounded by machines that captured sound and projected light. His grandfather made components for phonograph players. His father, Julius, designed projectors for movie theaters. Young Alan built ham radio sets from Popular Science Plans in Bridgeport and Milford, Connecticut, soldering circuits and tuning frequencies before he was old enough to drive. He studied engineering at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, graduating in 1948. His senior thesis was eerily prescient, a vacuum tube envelope follower that could track the attack, sustain, and decay of a sound wave, the exact parameters that would later define synthesizer architecture. He wrote, with a young engineer's caution, that the electronic instrument's value is chiefly as a novelty, but predicted the day when electronic instruments might take their place as versatile, powerful, and expressive. He later sat in on a Harvard course taught by Walter Brattain, who'd co-invented the transistor. At George A. Philbrick Researches, Pearlman became one of America's foremost experts on operational amplifiers, the foundational building blocks of analog electronics. His colleagues called him by his initials, a company fad. The founder was GAP. Alan Robert Pearlman became ARP. In 1962, Pearlman and a colleague named Roger Noble left Philbrick to found Nexus Research Laboratory in Canton, Massachusetts. There, Pearlman designed amplifier circuits for NASA, precision electronics for the Gemini and Apollo programs, the kind of work where a fraction of a degree of drift could mean the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. Nexus grew to $4 million in annual sales before Pearlman and Noble sold it to the Teledyne conglomerate in 1967. The sale made Pearlman wealthy and restless. The synthesizer idea consumed his next 2 years. By 1969, he was ready to build a company. He incorporated as Tonus Inc., later renamed ARP Instruments, and set up shop at 45 Kenneth Street in Newton, Massachusetts, a small cinder block warehouse. He put in $100,000 of his own money. A handful of investors matched it. Total starting capital, $200,000. But Pearlman knew he needed help. He was an engineer, not a salesman. He couldn't demo a synthesizer for a rock band any more than he could play lead guitar. So when his lawyer, Lewis Pollock, the same attorney who'd handled the Nexus Teledyne merger, mentioned that a young engineering and music prodigy was looking for exactly this kind of opportunity, Pearlman said yes. David Friend arrived like a comet. Raised in New York City, Friend had built his first oscillator from a vacuum tube at about age 8. His mother was a serious amateur musician. He double majored in engineering and music composition at Yale, where he'd wired the university's electronic music studio as a bursary job. He was pursuing graduate work at Princeton on a David Sarnoff fellowship when Pollock's phone call came. Friend dropped out of Princeton, drove to Boston, and walked into the Newton garage. He was roughly 21 years old. Inc. magazine would later call him the Whiz Kid, a talented and ambitious young man with a background in engineering and music but none in business. Friend would later joke about his own reputation. I'm the evil guy who commercialized synthesizers. The third figure in the triangle was Pollock himself. Never formally an officer of ARP, the lawyer nonetheless wielded enormous behind-the-scenes power as legal counsel and chairman of the executive committee. A board member named Joseph Mancuso estimated Pollock worked 40 hours a week at ARP. An unnamed insider told Inc., if any one person ran ARP, and that's debatable, then Pollock was that person. So the structure was set from the beginning. An engineer who didn't want to manage, a young prodigy who had energy but no experience, a lawyer pulling strings from behind the curtain. The three of them added up, in Mancuso's brutal later assessment, to about a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. They were about to build the most successful synthesizer company in the world. ARP's first instrument, the 2500, debuted in 1970. It was a modular synthesizer, a wall of electronic modules that could be wired together to create sounds no acoustic instrument could produce. ARP marketed it as the concert grand of synthesizers, and the price matched the ambition, north of $20,000 per system, aimed squarely at universities and serious electronic music studios. Yes, but the 2500's real innovation was invisible to anyone who wasn't an electrical engineer. Since Robert Moog had popularized the synthesizer in the mid-1960s, every manufacturer had struggled with the same maddening problem: oscillator drift. The voltage-controlled oscillators at the heart of every synthesizer were exquisitely sensitive to temperature. Play a Moog in a cold rehearsal hall, wait 30 minutes for the stage lights to heat the room, and the instrument would slide out of tune. Performers spent as much time tuning as playing. Pearlman, who'd spent 5 years building circuits stable enough for spacecraft, saw exactly what Moog had done wrong. Bob Moog had placed the logarithmic and exponential conversion functions on separate circuits at different temperatures, so they drifted apart as the room warmed. Pearlman's fix was elegant. Put matched transistors on a single integrated circuit chip, keeping them at the same temperature. The oscillators stayed in tune. Even Moog himself later acknowledged the superiority of ARP's early instruments in this regard. The 2500 also replaced the tangle patch cables that obscured Moog and Buchla panels with matrix signal switching. Pins pushed into a grid to make connections. Cleaner, more intuitive, easier to reproduce a setup. Roughly 102,500S were built over the company's lifetime. Few were sold, but those few ended up in the right hands. The instrument that changed everything came a year later. The ARP 2600, released in 1971 at a retail price that coincidentally matched its model number, $2,600, was designed by Pearlman and a key hire named Dennis Collin. The company's director of advanced R&D, Collin, was an extraordinary analog engineer in his own right. He'd created the Module 1047 multimode filter for the 2500. One of the first multimode filters ever built, capable of low-pass, high-pass, bandpass, and notch filtering simultaneously. For the 2600, he and Pearlman devised something the synthesizer world hadn't seen: semi-modular architecture. The 2600's signal path was internally pre-wired, meaning you could switch it on and immediately make sound. No patching required. But if you wanted to override those internal connections with patch cords, you could rebuild the signal path from scratch. This was the bridge no one else had built. Moog's modular systems required expert knowledge just to produce a single tone. Moog's Mini Moog was easy to play, but couldn't be reconfigured. The 2600 split the difference. Its front panel featured clear text labels and signal flow diagrams, making it the first synthesizer genuinely suited to education. The earliest units were hand-built in the Newton garage. Workers nicknamed them Blue Marvins, after CFO Marvin Cohen, for reasons no one seems to have recorded. Roughly 25 of those first models were made. They're among the rarest synthesizers in existence today. Then David Friend designed ARP's Mini Moog killer, the Odyssey. Released in 1972, the Odyssey was a duophonic synthesizer, 2 notes at once, with a 37-key keyboard and a feature set that made Moog players jealous. Ring modulation, oscillator sync, high-pass filtering, sample and hold, 2 full envelope generators. Where the Mini Moog was warm and fat, with its round enveloping bass, the Odyssey was sharp and aggressive. Musicians and critics would later call it the world's first punk rock synth. Its sliders gave it a futuristic look that made the Mini Moog's knobs seem old-fashioned. Friend and a musician named Roger Powell took the 2600 on the road, touring the country in a red Chevy van, demonstrating the instrument at music stores and dealer events. ARP signed endorsement deals with an astonishing roster: The Who, Stevie Wonder, Led Zeppelin, Herbie Hancock, and more than 100 other artists. Nobody in synthesizers had marketed this aggressively before. The company also made a decision that seems small, but says everything about ARP's character. Bob Moog used pitch bend wheels on his instruments. Round, intuitive, natural feeling. ARP almost reflexively refused to use wheels simply because Moog did. And instead, they created proportional pitch control pads, flat pressure-sensitive strips that performers found less expressive and harder to control. The company was, as one account put it, hypnotized by the idea that they had to design things differently from Moog. It was the first sign of an institutional stubbornness that would prove far more costly down the road. But in 1972, with the 2600 and the Odyssey both selling, ARP was no longer a garage startup. Production moved from Newton to a 50,000 square foot facility in Lexington, Massachusetts. The company was growing. The instruments were exceptional, and the sounds they made were about to become inescapable. Imagine walking onto the ARP factory floor in Lexington in the mid-1970s. It wasn't a steel mill or an auto plant. There were no blast furnaces, no stamping presses shaking the building. This was precision electronics manufacturing, and it looked more like a large laboratory than a factory. Long benches under fluorescent light where technicians soldered components onto circuit boards by hand, the faint, sweet smell of rosin flux hanging in the air, oscilloscopes glowing green at testing stations, and from somewhere down the line, always, the sound of a synthesizer being calibrated. A slow sweep through the frequency range, the tone climbing and falling like a question being asked over and over. About 200 people worked here at peak production. They were assembling instruments by hand, trimming resistors, matching transistor pairs for Pearlman's temperature-stable oscillator circuits, winding potentiometers, running each completed unit through calibration and quality testing before it was packed and shipped. This wasn't assembly line work in the Detroit sense. Each synthesizer required skilled hands and trained ears. A worker who couldn't hear the difference between a properly calibrated filter and one that was slightly off wasn't going to last. The product line expanded rapidly. After the 2500, the 2600, and the Odyssey, ARP released the Pro Soloist in 1972, a preset synthesizer that pioneered after-touch control, a pressure-sensitive bar beneath the keys that let performers add vibrato and pitch bend by pressing harder. The Pro Soloist also used digital ROM chips to store 30 presets. One of the first applications of digital memory in any musical instrument. Tony Banks of Genesis made it his signature keyboard. Cycling through presets during his marathon solo on The Cinema Show from Selling England by the Pound. In 1974, ARP began distributing the Selena String Ensemble, a polyphonic string synthesizer actually manufactured by the Dutch company Eminent, but rebranded for the American market. The Selena became the definitive string machine sound of the decade. That lush, slightly artificial wash of strings, heard on hundreds of disco and pop records. A year later came the ARP Omni, combining the Selena's string section with a monophonic bass synthesizer, and it became ARP's best-selling product. Roughly 4,000 units at a 1980 price of $2,450. Board member Joe Mancuso, who joined in 1976, suggested they price it $1,000 above cost. It sold better at the higher number. What poured out of the Lexington factory wasn't just hardware, it was the sound of the era. Edgar Winter was the first musician to make the ARP 2600 famous. He bought his at Manny's Music in New York in 1971, studied it for a month with synth guru Bob Margouleff, trading piano lessons for synthesis lessons, and then did something nobody had attempted. He detached the 2600's keyboard controller, ran a long cable to the main unit, and strapped the keyboard around his neck like a guitar. He'd essentially invented the keytar, his instrumental Frankenstein, built around the 2600's screaming oscillators, hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in May 1973. It was the most commercially successful ARP recording ever made. Stevie Wonder had his ARP 2600's control panel labeled in Braille. He used ARP instruments across the classic albums that redefined popular music. Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness, First Finale. And in 1973, he demonstrated the 2600 on Sesame Street, sitting beside a Muppet named Grover, showing children what electronic music could do. Herbie Hancock played the Odyssey on Chameleon from the million-selling Headhunters, that snaking, elastic bass line that opened a doorway between jazz and funk. Joe Zawinul of Weather Report commonly played two ARP 2600s at once, one for each hand, sometimes with the keyboard on one unit inverted so the notes ran backward. The two machines chained together for 6 oscillator chords that no single instrument could produce. Pete Townshend was one of the earliest and most creative adopters. Like the ARP 2500 appeared on Who's Next in 1971. On Won't Get Fooled Again, a Lowrey organ was processed through the 2500's envelope follower to create that famous rhythmic pulse that sounded like the future arriving at 4/4 time. The 2500 ran all through Quadrophenia 2 years later. David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, Low, Heroes, Lodger, featured ARP Pro Soloist, Odyssey, and Selena String Ensemble throughout. The Selena providing what producer Tony Visconti later called, without apology, a really cheesy sound that nonetheless defined those albums' atmosphere. In 1977, ARP appeared in 2 of the most iconic science fiction films ever made, and neither appearance was planned. Sound designer Ben Burt needed a voice for a small robot in a space opera that most of Hollywood expected to fail. Burt took an ARP 2600, fed a sample and hold low-frequency oscillator through the self-resonating filter to generate electronic chirps and whistles, and then, here was the trick, pushed his own voice through the resonating filter via a microphone. The human speech shaped the electronic sound, giving it cadence, emotion, the suggestion of personality. As Burt later explained, the secret was the human input, the performance from the person, the texture from the machine. The result was R2-D2, arguably the most recognizable synthetic voice in cinema history, a character beloved by millions, who speaks no human language and was born on a Massachusetts-built synthesizer. That same ARP 2600 would later produce the sound of the Ark of the Covenant being opened in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Meanwhile, ARP's VP of Engineering, Philip Dodds, I was dispatched to install an ARP 2500 on the set of Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The 2500 was to appear on screen, a fully loaded unit with 2 wing cabinets and a dual keyboard, as the instrument used to communicate with the alien mothership. When Dodds arrived on set to supervise the installation, Spielberg liked his look and cast him on the spot. Dodds, a 26-year-old electronics technician who joined ARP while still a student at Worcester Polytechnic, the same school Pearlman had attended decades earlier, spent 9 weeks filming the role of Jean-Claude, the musician who plays the famous 5-note sequence. He has considerable screen time, including a speaking part, in one of the most iconic scenes in science fiction. An engineer from a 50,000-square-foot factory in Lexington, Massachusetts, communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence on a soundstage in Hollywood. The instrument he'd helped build talking to the stars. Beyond the marquee names, ARP's instruments wove themselves into the fabric of recorded music so thoroughly that listing every appearance would fill a small book. ABBA's Gimme, Gimme, Gimme featured the Odyssey. Elton John's Funeral for a Friend used the 2500, played by engineer David Henschel. The ARP 2600 provided the bass line for Madonna's Borderline and appeared on Michael Jackson's Thriller. Daniel Miller, the producer behind early Depeche Mode, stated flatly that the 2600 was used on all the albums he was involved with. By the mid-1970s, ARP Instruments held approximately 40% of the global synthesizer market, the largest share of any manufacturer in the world. The company that had started in a cinderblock garage with $200,000 was outselling Moog, which had been swallowed by the Norland conglomerate in 1973 and was struggling under corporate ownership. Lexington, Massachusetts, a town better known for the opening shots of the American Revolution, had become the unlikely capital of American electronic music manufacturing. The instruments were extraordinary. The artist roster was unmatched. The cultural footprint was permanent. And if you'd walked into that 50,000-square-foot plant in 1977 and told anyone working there that the company had 4 years left, they would have thought you were out of your mind. 1977. Record annual revenue, $7 million. 40% of a global market estimated at $25 million. The largest synthesizer manufacturer on Earth. 200 employees in Lexington. New Chevrolet Blazers passed out to members of management. Board meetings followed, on at least one occasion, by an elaborate dinner party. On paper, it looked like an empire, but the numbers underneath the headline told a different story. Net earnings on that $7 million in sales came to $232,000, a profit margin of 3.3%. One bad quarter, one failed product, one unexpected expense, and the buffer was gone. Board member Joe Mancuso saw it clearly. He'd been pushing for years to recruit a proper CEO, someone with the business experience that neither Pearlman nor Friend possessed, and that Pollock, for all his behind-the-scenes influence, couldn't provide. But the Troika wouldn't yield authority. Pearlman didn't want to manage, but didn't want to be managed either. Our friend had delivered the Odyssey, the Omni, the celebrity endorsements. His confidence was high. Pollock blocked any move that might diminish his own control. Mancuso's assessment was devastating and precise. Among the three of them, I couldn't get one full-time chief executive officer. Alone, they're each worth about 0.4 on a scale of 1 to 10. Together, they add up to about a 2. And the competitive landscape was shifting beneath them. In San Jose, California, a small company called Sequential Circuits was developing something ARP couldn't yet imagine, a programmable polyphonic synthesizer with digital patch memory, the Prophet 5, which would arrive in 1978 and make every analog manufacturer's product line look like yesterday. In Japan, Roland, Korg, and Yamaha were investing heavily in affordable instruments that would reshape the low end of the market. Oberheim was building polyphonic machines. The technology was moving toward microprocessors, digital control, preset storage, capabilities that required a completely different engineering philosophy than the one that had made ARP great. None of this was visible from inside the Lexington factory, not yet. In 1977, ARP was ascendant. The instruments were on every major record. The 2600 had just given voice to the most popular robot in movie history. Revenue was at an all-time high. What happened next would begin with an idea that seemed, to the man who championed it, like the most logical move the company had ever made. The idea, on its face, wasn't crazy. In the mid-1970s, there were roughly 4 times as many guitarists in American rock bands as keyboard players. Synthesizers were selling to keyboardists, pianists, organists, the classically trained and the experimentally inclined. But the guitar was the dominant instrument of popular music, and no manufacturer had figured out how to let a guitarist control a synthesizer with the instrument they already knew how to play. If ARP could crack that problem, it wouldn't just expand its market, it would own a category. David Friend saw this clearly. Around 1976, he and an engineer named Tim Gillette began developing a pitch-to-voltage converter, a device that could analyze the vibrations of a guitar string and translate them into the control signals that drove a synthesizer's oscillators, filters, and amplifiers. Attach this converter to a modified ARP Odyssey, strip off the keyboard, add a hexaphonic guitar pickup, and you'd have an instrument that could make a guitar sound like anything a synthesizer could produce. They called it the Avatar. Friend's business plan projected $4 million in first-year Avatar sales, from a company doing $7 million total. It was, in other words, a bet that a single untested product would account for more than half of all revenue growth. Alan Pearlman was opposed, fiercely, specifically, and on the record. He wrote a memo to the board of directors calling the Avatar the most risky of all projects that they had undertaken, warning of a lot of unsolved problems related to sound synthesis and analysis. Pearlman understood something Friend either didn't see or chose to ignore. The physics of guitar strings made accurate pitch tracking extraordinarily difficult. A guitar string doesn't vibrate at a single clean frequency. It produces a complex waveform full of harmonics, overtones, and transient noise. Finger slides, pick attacks, fret buzz, string mutes. Extracting a single clean pitch from that mess, fast enough for a performer to play in real time, was a problem that the technology of the late 1970s couldn't reliably solve. But Pearlman had, by his own later admission, virtually lost his voice at ARP. Friend had delivered the Odyssey and the Omni, 2 of the company's biggest commercial successes. His political capital was high. He aligned with Lewis Pollock, whose behind-the-scenes influence could move any board vote. Pearlman recalled the dynamic with quiet bitterness. It became a political party. The guitar party. It was blasphemy to question anything about it. He feared the board would fire him if he pushed back harder. Philip Dodds, ARP's VP of Engineering, also dissented. Dodds agreed to participate in the Avatar project only on the condition that ARP simultaneously develop a keyboard version of the polyphonic synthesizer, a true next-generation instrument that could compete with whatever was coming from Sequential Circuits and Oberheim. Friend agreed to the condition. Schott then killed the keyboard version and diverted virtually the entire R&D budget, roughly $500,000, to the guitar project. Dodds later called the Centaur, the Avatar's ambitious, six-voice polyphonic companion, the biggest boondoggle you've ever seen. The dissenter had been overruled. The engineer had been silenced. The company was all in. The Avatar project had three components. The Avatar itself was essentially a keyboardless ARP odyssey with pitch-to-voltage conversion circuitry. A monophonic guitar synthesizer retailing at nearly $3,000. The Centaur 6 was the Dream Machine, a massive six-voice polyphonic guitar synthesizer containing 115 printed circuit boards, and the keyboard version of the Centaur, the instrument Dodds had demanded, the one that might have competed with Sequential Circuit's forthcoming Prophet 5, was shelved. Total investment in the Avatar program would reach approximately $4 million, more than half a year's revenue, poured into a technology that couldn't do what it promised. The fundamental problem was latency. When a guitarist plucked a string, the pitch converter needed time to analyze the vibration and determine the note. On the low E string, the delay was approximately 40 milliseconds. In the next octave up, 20 milliseconds. Higher still, 10. At the very top of the range, 5. 40 milliseconds doesn't sound like much. But for a guitarist accustomed to hearing a note the instant a pick strikes a string, 40 milliseconds is an eternity. A gap between intention and response that makes fluid, expressive playing nearly impossible, and latency was only the beginning. So the converter couldn't handle anything but the cleanest possible signal. An accidental string mute confused it. A harmonic overtone confused it. A pick scrape, a finger slide, any of the thousands of tiny physical events that happen during normal guitar playing, each one could send the synthesizer screaming off to the wrong note or no note at all. Players had to use heavy-gauge strings for maximum signal clarity. They needed a custom hexaphonic pickup professionally installed. They had to fundamentally alter their technique, playing with a precision and restraint that stripped the guitar of exactly the expressiveness that made people want to play guitar in the first place. And after all of that, after the custom pickup, the heavy strings, the modified technique, the careful avoidance of anything that might confuse the converter, the Avatar was monophonic. One note at a time. A guitarist who could play chords, harmonies, riffs with 6 strings vibrating simultaneously was reduced to a single melodic line, played carefully, with a perceptible delay on every note below the 12th fret. The Centaur was worse. Pearlman performed a failure analysis on the prototype, 115 circuit boards, each one a potential point of failure, and calculated that the average time between breakdowns was approximately 2 hours. The estimated retail price would have been around $15,000. Only one prototype was ever built. The market response confirmed what Pearlman had warned. ARP sold roughly $1 million worth of avatars over the product's 2-year lifespan. Against a business plan that had projected $4 million in year 1, fewer than 300 units may have been produced. Competitors fared no better. Roland's GR 500 and 360 Systems guitar synthesizers met similar indifference, but ARP's competitors hadn't bet the company on the category. In 1979, ARP posted an operating loss of approximately $700,000 and took an inventory write-off of roughly $300,000. Pearlman's summary was blunt. Essentially, we blew our brains out on that instrument, but the financial hemorrhage, devastating as it wasn't even the worst damage. The worst damage was the road not taken. By killing the keyboard version of the Centaur and diverting all resources to the guitar project, ARP had surrendered the future of keyboard synthesis to its competitors. In 1978, while ARP was shipping avatars that guitarists couldn't play, a tiny California company called Sequential Circuits released the Prophet 5. The first practical programmable polyphonic synthesizer with digital patch memory. A player could design a sound, store it, and recall it instantly. No other keyboard could do this. The Prophet 5 changed everything, and ARP had nothing to answer it with. ARP did release the Quadra in 1978, a 4-section instrument combining strings, bass, polyphonic synth, and lead synth. But the Quadra was built from recycled analog circuit boards The same technology ARP had been iterating on for years. Sound on Sound later placed the Quadra in what it called the remedial class compared to the Prophet 5. ARP had ceded its technological leadership to chase a guitar market that didn't exist, and in doing so had lost the keyboard market that had built the company. The gap between what ARP was and what ARP could have been is one of the cruelest ironies in the history of American manufacturing. The polyphonic keyboard synthesizer that Friend killed, the one Dodds had demanded as a condition of his participation, would eventually be completed and sold, but not by ARP, not in time to save anyone's job, and not before the company that had outsold every synthesizer maker in the world was reduced to shipping instruments on consignment and borrowing money from its own founder to make payroll. The external pressures were real. Japanese manufacturers, Roland, Korg, Yamaha, were advancing rapidly with affordable, reliable instruments built for the mass market. Its microprocessor-controlled polyphonic synthesizers from Sequential Circuits and Oberheim represented a generational leap that ARP's analog recycling philosophy couldn't match. The competitive landscape was changing faster than any single company, even a healthy one, could adapt. But ARP wasn't healthy. The Avatar had burned through $4 million in the company's credibility, and the management dysfunction that had enabled the bet now prevented the rescue. Joe Mancuso tried to save the company the only way left, selling it. He found a willing buyer. Gulf and Western Manufacturing made an informal offer of $10 per share, when the stock was trading around $4. It would have preserved jobs, kept the brand alive, and given every shareholder a substantial premium. The board refused. Lewis Pollock, wielding his behind-the-scenes authority, required that both the board and his law firm approve any conversation between an ARP officer and a prospective buyer. The restriction effectively strangled any deal before negotiations could begin. For his efforts to sell the company, Mancuso was fired. The spiral accelerated through 1980. Suppliers, sensing the company's fragility, shifted to COD-only terms. First National Bank was, as accounts from the period describe, making angry noises. ARP began shipping instruments to dealers with promises to buy them back if unsold, consignment selling that masked declining demand behind the appearance of revenue. In late 1980, Pearlman made a final desperate move. He personally lent ARP $168,000, his own money, from the fortune he'd built designing amplifiers for NASA, so the company could ship $1 million backlog of instruments in November and December. The idea was straightforward. Ship the backlog, book the revenue, break even for the year, and buy time to find a path forward. In January 1981, they ran the numbers. The effort had produced a $300,000 loss. Pearlman had lent his own company $168,000 and watched it disappear. ARP declared bankruptcy in May 1981. The company ceased operations by September. Stockholders and creditors lost more than $4 million. Pearlman and his family lost approximately $500,000 in cash and $1 million in paper assets. The man who had designed circuits for the Apollo program, who had solved the oscillator drift problem that had plagued every synthesizer manufacturer on Earth, who had built the instrument that gave voice to R2-D2, that man lost $1.5 million trying to save a company that two other men had steered into a wall. Philip Dodds was the only employee retained. The bankruptcy trustee kept him on to oversee the disposition of assets. Everyone else was laid off. The building was emptied. 200 people had worked in that factory, 200 paychecks that paid rent in Lexington, that bought groceries in Concord, that put kids through school in the suburbs west of Boston. Gone in the space of a few months because one product bet went wrong, and the people in charge couldn't agree on how to fix it, or even whether it needed fixing. Dodds later defended his former boss. One person who was very much maligned during the troubles at ARP was Al Pearlman. Friend offered a cooler epitaph. We were in a risky business and we made one bad move. On top of that, we had some lousy management that blew away what little we had. That was the end of the ball game. What happened next is the strangest chapter in the story, and in some ways the most painful. Philip Dodds, alone in the emptied factory, did what no one else could. He negotiated the sale of ARP's remaining inventory and assets to CBS Musical Instruments, the corporate parent of Fender and Rhodes. The price for the inventory, $300,000. For an additional $50,000, CBS acquired manufacturing rights to the Chroma synthesizer and a 4-voice electronic piano, $350,000 total, for the assets of what had been the world's leading synthesizer manufacturer. Then Dodds did something remarkable. He reassembled the entire ARP engineering team, the technicians and designers who'd been laid off months earlier, at a CBS facility in Woburn, Massachusetts. Many of these people had taken personal risks to come back. Mortgages, family obligations, the uncertainty of joining a project that might be canceled at any moment. They came back anyway. They finished the instrument that David Friend had killed and that Philip Dodds had fought to keep alive. The Rhodes Chroma shipped in 1982, 16-voice polyphony, a velocity-sensitive weighted wooden keyboard with 256 levels of touch response, a single slider parameter editing system that was years ahead of its time, an interface concept that would later influence the Yamaha DX7, the best-selling synthesizer in history. The first 50 production units were hand-built by the development team, the same people who'd built 2600s and Odysseys on the Lexington line. In its first year, CBS sold more than $3 million worth of Chromas, a nearly tenfold return on a $350,000 investment. Approximately 3,000 units were produced before CBS sold Fender in 1985 and shuttered the synthesis division. $3 million. From an instrument that ARP could have released in 1979 or 1980, if the Avatar hadn't consumed every dollar and every engineer. $3 million that would have represented a 43% increase in revenue over ARP's 1977 peak. $3 million that could have kept the Lexington factory open, kept 200 people employed. I kept the company alive long enough to navigate the transition to digital synthesis that was about to sweep the industry. Instead, CBS got the instrument for the price of a modest house. The ARP diaspora scattered across the technology landscape. David Friend became a serial entrepreneur, founding at least 7 companies over the following decades: Computer Pictures Corporation, Pilot Software, FaxNet, Sonexus, and most successfully, Carbonite, the cloud backup company. He was named Ernst and Young Entrepreneur of the Year in 2010. He became CEO of Wasabi Technologies. Berklee College of Music named a concert hall after him. The man who championed the Avatar rebuilt his career many times over. Philip Dodds worked at CBS through 1985, then became VP of R&D at Kurzweil Music, another Massachusetts synthesizer company founded by another visionary engineer. He later left the music industry entirely for military computer-based training, became chief architect of SCORM for the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative, and died in 2007 at the age of 56. Dennis Collin, who'd co-designed the 2600 with Pearlman and created the legendary 1047 filter, went on to design the Aries 300 modular synthesizer and founded Collin Electronics, producing high-end analog components until his death in 2015. Mary Locke, ARP's tech support and service manager to the very last day, followed the pipeline from ARP to the Rhodes Chroma project to Kurzweil. Roger Powell, who toured the country demonstrating the 2600 from a red Chevy van, joined Todd Rundgren's band Utopia. She created one of the first handheld synthesizer controllers, developed an early MIDI sequencer, and eventually became a senior programmer at Apple Computer, working on professional audio applications. The knowledge that had been concentrated in one 50,000 square foot building in Lexington dispersed into a dozen companies across a dozen industries. Kurzweil, Apple, Berklee, Carbonite. The engineers who'd built the instruments that scored the 1970s carried ARP's circuit design DNA into the broader American technology economy. The company was dead. The expertise was unkillable. Alan Pearlman founded a small software company called Selva Systems after ARP's collapse. It was based in Wellesley, Massachusetts, 10 miles, as Encore magazine noted with quiet devastation, from the site of ARP's luxurious 50,000 square foot plant. He worked from a small office one flight above a store that sold electronics kits. He consulted on the Time Warp 2600, a software emulation of his most famous instrument, the only ARP 2600 recreation he personally endorsed. He worked on renewable energy technology. He stayed quiet. He didn't give many interviews. He didn't seek credit. He was, as he had always been, a nerd before the term was invented. Not a fame seeker, not a big small talk guy. In 2015, the Japanese company Korg released a reissue of the ARP Odyssey, with David Friend serving as advisor. The original circuits faithfully reproduced, all three filter types, from the Odyssey's three production eras, selectable via a single switch. In January 2020, Korg unveiled the ARP 2600FS, a full-size handcrafted reproduction of Pearlman's masterpiece, priced at $3,900. It sold out almost immediately. Resale prices climbed past $7,000, past $10,000. A smaller version, the 2600M, followed in 2022. Original vintage ARP 2600s now sell for $8,000 to $12,000 or more. The roughly 25 surviving Blue Marvins from that first Newton Garage production run, the ones named after CFO Marvin Cohen, are among the rarest and most sought-after synthesizers on Earth. The Lexington factory is a biotech campus now. The benches where technicians hand-soldered oscillator circuits are gone. The calibration stations are gone. The fluorescent lights under which 200 people assembled instruments that shaped the sound of an era, gone. The building still stands, repurposed, retenanted, serving a different Massachusetts industry in a different century. Alan Robert Pearlman died on January 5th, 2019, in Newton, Massachusetts. He was 93 years old. His daughter Dinah wrote on Facebook, "At 93, too weak to speak, he still managed to play the piano this morning, later passing away peacefully in the afternoon. Too weak to speak, still able to play. That was the man. The circuits were always more fluent than the conversation. The instruments said what he couldn't. The ARP 2600 spoke in Stevie Wonder's hands and chirped in Ben Burtt's studio and sang 5 notes to an alien mothership on a Spielberg soundstage, and all of it, every oscillator sweep, every filter resonance, every stable, odd temperature-proof tone, traced back to a quiet engineer in a Connecticut basement who heard a Bach album played on a machine and thought, I can build a better one." He was mentioned at the 2019 Grammy Awards. His daughter established the Alan R. Pearlman Foundation that year, running programs that give new generations of musicians access to vintage ARP instruments at a studio in Boston called The Record Company. The circuits are still humming. Kids are still turning the knobs. The company lasted 12 years. The instruments will last forever. And somewhere in the distance between those two facts, between a 12-year company and an instrument that still speaks, is the whole story. An engineer who built something extraordinary, a partnership that couldn't hold, a product that didn't work, a factory that went quiet. And the sound that outlived all of it, still rising from the circuits of machines that were assembled by hand in a building in Lexington, Massachusetts, where the work has ended, but the music hasn't stopped.